Hey, and welcome to this podcast where we are going to open up a topic that many people want to talk about, but few people are willing to open the conversation. And that is the topic of cannabis and Christians. Now, as soon as you open that topic, immediately you've got a whole school of thought of people who are like, oh my God, God is against psychoactive medication. God's against a psychoactive plant. You can use CBD, but you can't use THC. You can't be using both because then you would be psychoactive, out of your mind. And if you're out of your mind, you can't be full of the Holy Spirit. Then there's other people over here who are like, cannabis has actually saved my life. Cannabis was actually the thing that got me off of all medications when I had cancer. Cannabis is the thing that finally relieved my PTSD. Cannabis is the thing that helps me to sleep. Cannabis is the thing that drew me closer to God. Cannabis is the thing that helped with my depression and anxiety, and so on. So, what I want to do is present not only my personal experience, but also some of the hundreds of hours of research that I have done, not only on this plant, but also on where we may have erred as Christians and how we can actually hold to our own personal convictions, which is what we're admonished to do, but also lay aside the judgment and possibly open our mind to a new perspective. So, cannabis and the Christian, pot, marijuana, Mary Jane. Yeah, it's got all kinds of names. My story starts back in, I think it was like 2004, when chronic pain from fibromyalgia, many other diagnoses, multiple autoimmune conditions, ulcerative colitis that would later expand to pancolitis, and then Crohn's disease, rheumatoid arthritis, and to tell you the truth, over 15 autoimmune conditions were ravaging my body. And in 2004 till 2017, I was on opiates, prednisone, had used variety of anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, you name it. Here's the thing. If many of you know about my story, and those of you who are listening to me as a new listener, it's my honor to not only have you here, but also to share my story. I had experienced horrific trauma in my lifetime. As a matter of fact, I've gone through a complete transformation of my life in the last 3 years and still working on releasing some of that trauma and opening my heart to the healing that God has. Trauma such as molestation as a child, abuse as a kid, being gang raped in my 20s, living with a very predatory spouse, etc. And so I have a lot of empathy for people who are suffering. When I get ready to give you some of my convictions and what I actually did to get off of all that medication without any side effects and stay off of it for over 3 years, take my life back, get back into the gym, and be lifting over 550 pounds with my legs for 12 reps. I want you to know that I'm not saying that because I believe everybody's story will be mine. I'm not saying it because I believe you need to make my convictions yours. I'm just saying I'm going to report, you decide, and let's see if we can't find a place of unity amongst us. Now, a lot of Christians, when they're against cannabis, I've heard of a variety of things. Having over 3 million people who engage with me on social media gives me quite the case study on my own. And even when I first moved to Arizona, I relocated to Arizona because after filing for a divorce and starting on a path that would change the entire trajectory of my life, including healing my body and giving me back my strength, etc., I knew that the only way I was going to get off these opiates and the prednisone long term was to use cannabis. I had done all my research. My doctors had offered me a substitute medication like naltrexone or Suboxone to try to wean off the medications and eliminate as many of the side effects as I could. But I would discover later that that's not the case. Many of those medications become even more addictive. And I really did not believe that I needed or had to suffer, as so many people had said, to get off the medication that I had been using for pain relief from all of these conditions. So I did what I typically do as a business owner. I started doing my research. And I discovered the usage of cannabis. I actually coached with some of the top leaders in the world on the topic. I actually have a physician in Manhattan who had been giving me stem cells and peptide injections and bioidentical hormone therapy, and had gotten me to the point where the next and the greatest step would be to get off of my opiates and prednisone. So I relocated to Arizona. My weaning started when I was in Kansas, where it was completely illegal to even use CBD, which would have technically a less than 0.02% THC in it. And acupuncture, a lot of spiritual healing, and that helped me to go from 140 milligrams of Oxycontin combined with Percocet and 90 milligrams of prednisone down to about 80, cutting it in about half. And I couldn't get any further because no matter what I used, I was using all different kinds of things to help my norepinephrine levels, my magnesium levels, trying to get good sleep, etc. But I really got to that point where I couldn't break through any further. And I knew that cannabis was going to be it. So when I got to Arizona, I began using cannabis. And in an upcoming podcast that'll be on Monday, you'll hear a little bit more about that story. Some of it was good, some of it was not so good. Some of the things that I first started initially, unfortunately, made me very high. And that was never my intention. I had no intention of being quote unquote drunk, intoxicated, or high. I wanted to get off the opiates. Now, many of you who have used opiates or prednisone or the combination of the both already know that that alters the way you think. It alters your perception. It facilitates a dissociative type response in the brain, even, and created a situation where I wasn't really feeling emotionally, let alone physically, a lot of things. I hadn't been in the gym in over 30 years. When I was in my 20s, I had done competitive bodybuilding. And when these diseases started ravaging through my body, I just stopped working out altogether. Every time I would go back to the gym, I would end up getting hurt, which is not too unlikely because I was on opiates. And long story short, I knew this was going to be the biggest thing. I wasn't addicted to them. My body was tolerant. I've got doctors in Kansas City, even a doctor at Integrity Pain Management at Mayo Clinic in Phoenix, Arizona, who have even said that they would write a report that I did not have addiction issues. I had a tolerance issue. Now, here's the thing. An addiction to opioids actually has a lot to do with a psychological need. A tolerance has everything to do with a physiological need, meaning my body didn't know how to operate without it. So, what I had to do is teach my body how to live without it. And I didn't realize how dumbed down, I guess, for a lack of a better word, I actually was. Because the more I weaned off of them, and when I came completely off of them again, without side effects, I created an entire protocol that you can use for this. I began to notice my brain thinking at a totally different level. Like the first month or so of coming off of all the opioids and prednisone and microdosing with cannabis and CBD, I felt like I took a limitless pill. I felt like my brain had tapped into levels of thinking again and processing information like when I was in my 20s. As a matter of fact, some of the trauma being released even came rushing in because I was no longer, to be honest with you, mind altered by these medications. I also wasn't mind altered by daily ravaging pain. I thought going off all of these, I would eventually get to a point where the pain level would be so bad that I wouldn't be able to tolerate it. That's not what happened. It was the craziest thing to me. My pain didn't increase, my strength increased. My focus increased. My ability to sleep uninterrupted became a normal part of my life. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that on a podcast I did on Monday with an expert. But when you haven't slept straight through the night without constantly waking up most of your life, I mean, the first couple of months, I just felt like all I wanted to do was sleep. And it's something because I was met by a group of people who were so strongly against my speaking on the cannabis usage that it really took me back for a while. I mean, I really went to go to seek Holy Spirit and like, what is this? Nobody bothered me when I was on high doses of Oxycontin. No one ever bothered me when years ago I was on Klonopin and anti-anxiety. No one bothered me when I was on antidepressants, prednisone, when I had electroconvulsive therapy in my late 20s, trying to break free from depression and even suicidal thoughts because of the trauma. No one bothered me. Nobody challenged me. Nobody said I didn't have enough faith. Nobody said I was doing something wrong. Nobody said the Holy Spirit can't dwell in me anymore because of those things. And so it was extremely perplexing to me when not only were people challenging me, offended, unfollowing me on some of my social media channels. But the more I walked in the truth of that, I actually even had leaders that I wasn't even at their church who called me into a meeting in Arizona to tell me I was following the agenda of Satan. That's when I knew that God was doing something, because the agenda of Satan is the amount of people in the local congregation who are on opioids, who are on antidepressants, who are on anti-anxieties, who are on barbiturates, who are on anti-psychoactives, and the list could go on. And so I began to do just hundreds of hours of research on this plant. And I'm here to tell you that when we understand cannabis usage, one of the things I need to tell you, and unfortunately, I think it's foolish that I would even have to give this kind of disclaimer, but I'm going to give it. Self-control is an issue. Self-control is an issue. Using cannabis doesn't mean you have a license to escape and use however much as you want any more than it was okay for me to double dose on my Oxycontin. No, using self-control, even recreationally, should come under the government self-governing self-control of like alcohol. Now, if you're going to use anything, you can get high as a kite and disassociate and have mind altering on sugar. Go eat 10 pounds of chocolate. Go eat, a six-pack of some soda full of sugar and tell me you don't feel altered, because you will. The issue here, and boy, that's dangerous. In most pulpits, you're going to teach on self-control, because now you got to teach on gluttony and drunkenness and lying and everything else to do with self-control. And yet, one of the biggest arguments that Christians have given me is, well, you can't use the THC because it's psychoactive. So I began to do my research even more. Not only do we have an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and pain in the local church, we have a complete misunderstanding of what the endocannabinoid system is that God himself gave us in our body. And we have a horrific misrepresentation of what psychoactive medicines, drugs, and substances actually are. A lot of Christians who refuted me and who didn't want me to talk about it, or even said it was the agenda of Satan, drink coffee. Did you know that caffeine is a psychoactive substance? According to Wikipedia, just do a simple Google search. It alters your mind. Are you aware that a glass of wine, a shot of tequila, is psychoactive? Nicotine, psychoactive. So if we're going to say that you can't use cannabis because it's psychoactive and God doesn't want you to have any psychoactive substance and you can't have any kind of mind altering, then I got to shut down all these potluck dinners y'all are having with your gallons and gallons of coffee and your pounds and pounds of sugar and your pounds and pounds of junk food while you're all fellowshipping with the Lord. Because that's like my Bible says, watch out, hypocrite. Here's the thing, though. All things are acceptable, but not all things are profitable, Paul said. This is not a license to do whatever you want and escape. A lot of things that can be beneficial for us come with an enormous need for the law of restraint. A lot of things like sex in marriage, using the internet in general, Going on social media? When's the last time you checked your phone? Because your phone will report to you how many hours you're spending on social media. Please don't argue with me about self control with cannabis. If you're spending 5 hours or more on the internet every day and you're not making money, see, I've been a business person for 26 years. I'm very aware that there are many things that are very good and effective and powerful for the mind and for us, but a misuse could be lethal. A misuse could damage your credibility. Now, if you want to approach cannabis that way, I do too. It's how I had to approach opioids. For years, I used a low dose opioid. And then when I had over 20 lesions on my spine, a torsacrum, and discs in my neck buckling into my spinal cord, in 2014, they put me on Oxycontin. I did not drive from 2014 till 2017. Why? Because self control and restraint demanded that I honor the laws that exist and not put fellow drivers and myself in danger. Now, if we're going to talk about anxiety, depression, and pain, we've got to talk about trauma. We have to talk about how the body keeps score, how the body is holding trauma. We can't keep, leading someone in a prayer and saying, get rid of your trauma. You can't keep leading someone in a prayer and saying, get rid of your pain. I've experienced profound medical miracles, but I've also experienced profound medical healings that take a process. The issue is we are a tripartite being, body, soul, spirit. And if you're going to talk to me about not using THC because it's psychoactive, we must also talk about the things that are affecting your body and your soul and your spirit, but no one wants to go there. Let's talk about alcohol. Let's talk about caffeine. Let's talk about nicotine. Oh, please don't even open the door to antidepressants or anti-anxieties or opioids or tranquilizers or, mood stabilizers or stimulants or benzodiazepines or sedatives or or barbiturates or antipsychotics or anesthesia, for crying out loud. If your conviction is that you can't use anything psychoactive because God's against psychoactive, then you better not ever have surgery because you're going to need anesthesia unless you plan on being operated awake. We need to look at cannabis like a medicine. In the 1940s and the 1950s, cannabis was used at Johns Hopkins University by a bunch of doctors and scientists to help people with trauma, PTSD, as well as pain. And I'm going to do another episode on how cannabis helps the releasing of trauma, how it aids the plasticity of the brain, what the endocannabinoid system actually is. And is it really the cannabis that's healing? Or is it a substance, cannabis, that is helping the endocannabinoid system that God gave us to heal and do what it was designed to do? I don't believe in cannabis use without self-control. I'm not supporting being high and going, somewhere any more than I don't, going to a place that you don't have to deal with things, dissociate. Any more than I believe in having 5 glasses of wine and saying it's okay. Now, my Bible forbids drunkenness, but that doesn't mean you can't have a glass of wine. Just because you feel a slight buzz from 1 glass of wine isn't drunkenness. One of the things that Christians do is they major on what they disagree on, and they don't major on unity. This whole issue, if you haven't even studied 50 hours on the history of cannabis, the medical uses of cannabis, and why it became illegal, I don't even want to have a conversation about it, because now you're just going off a conversation where you're regurgitating something somebody else said. But here's the thing. My doctor said to me that I would likely be on opioids the rest of my life. I used an enormous amount of self-control when I was on them. It took self-control to not constantly be raising the dose. It took self-control to not drive. It took self-control to be aware. There's a lot of things I can't do because of these opioids. And it took self-control to wean off of them, to search, hunt, tons of hours with the best specialists and my own study to find how to support my body so I could wean off of them without side effects, how to help my norepinephrine levels, my dopamine levels, all of the different hormonal levels. etc. And it took self-control to navigate my way through hundreds, if not thousands of strains that are out there, find the one that would be best for me, and even find the usage that would be best for me. I now will microdose with a small inhalation method called a pen, and I use gummies at night. I used to use a bong for a very strong plant dose when I take my Remicade infusions every 6 weeks because of the nausea and pain and stuff that accompanies that. But I now have been finding that using gummies and using a low dose inhalation has been even more effective. The rule of thumb truly is the least amount for the greatest result. Um, that's what we need for caffeine. That's what you need for alcohol if you're going to drink alcohol. And I understand that many of you don't drink caffeine and you don't touch any of these things and you don't use any kind of pharmaceutical whatsoever. And we all have a free will to choose what our convictions are. But this is the issue that I take issue with. Telling someone that they can no longer lead worship because they use cannabis to go to sleep at night. Not a problem if they're using Klonopin. I actually had a major prophet in the church tell me that he uses Klonopin periodically because he wakes up quite a bit at night. But he was very vocal on not letting anyone use cannabis. This makes no sense to me. This is not an equal balance that pleases the Lord. This is not discernment. This is not proper judgment. Now, if you don't feel comfortable using cannabis and you feel okay with using a sleeping pill or a Klonopin or an Ambien, all you people who fly overseas and are Christians and get your Ambien fixed before you get there, but you don't have the right to judge someone who doesn't want to use the pharmaceutical drugs and does want to use the cannabis. Are there going to be problems with everything? Yeah, there's problems with every single medication I've mentioned. There's problems with alcohol. There's problems with people being addicted to food and caffeine. But for some reason, it rests underneath the guise of that's okay because it doesn't impair your fellowship with the Holy Spirit. I beg to differ with you. If you struggle with food and you're very overweight and you hate yourself and you self-judge yourself all the time and you're using cannabis, you're using caffeine in the morning to get energy to even function, and you're drinking alcohol or eating an enormous amount of food to go to sleep at night, that's a massive sign of trauma. That's a massive problem that, yes, the Holy Spirit's totally capable of, but it could be something as easily as switching hormones and different things like that in a small dose of cannabis. Some people don't realize that cannabis can actually suppress your appetite and cannabis can increase your appetite. I don't get the munchies because anything I use during the day is usually sativa, and I use a sativa that doesn't cause me to get the munchies. I use a very small amount because I obviously run companies. I work out 6 days a week. I had somebody say to me, "Oh my God, you're turning into a pothead." Really? When's the last time you knew a pothead who ran 2 multi-million-dollar companies and works out 6 days a week? My concern is this, and I'm going to say this in closing. Use wisdom, use discernment, use discretion. But to say that God doesn't like cannabis because it's psychoactive, I hope you now realize is a faulty statement. To say Christians can't ever use cannabis because it's psychoactive, that's a faulty statement. What's happening is because of the programming that happened in the 60s and the 70s on this plant, we have a lot of people regurgitating that information and acting like it's God's wisdom. Who created this plant in the first place? So I will close with this. The Holy Spirit has asked me to break shame off that plant. When you break shame off of even your own life, you're going to get a higher level of understanding and discernment and self-control. Shame is a vile, vile spirit that will cause you to do things that you would later regret, that will cause you to sink to a low that is very difficult to escape. And again, I don't have judgment against all the Christians who are using antidepressants and anti-anxieties and things like that. But I do have a massive concern for how many do. I have a massive concern as to why the releasing of trauma is not being taught, facilitated, or upheld in the typical church. And I have an even bigger problem. As an apostle, as a prophet, when people say that you shouldn't use cannabis because God doesn't like it and God doesn't want you to use psychoactive materials, My friends, my Bible says that God requires that we walk with self control, with diligence, with faith. Mhm. And we're also supposed to love each other as we love ourselves. I hope this has given you some food for thought. I guarantee you the 2.5 hour podcast is going to be released on Monday. The video will be on YouTube as well. Is going to give you a lot of food for thought. We're not only going to talk about cannabis, but there's a topic that I will go into very carefully, but I will go into it in a very educated way, and that is the use of microdosing psychedelics for PTSD and trauma. Let me put it this way. When the doctors wanted me to take naltrexone or Suboxone to wean off of opiates, a typical dose might be anywhere between 30, 40, even up to 80 milligrams. Naltrexone, however, is being used very successfully for many, many years with MS, but you use a very small dose, like 1 milligram, half a milligram. That's called microdosing. If you were microdosing even acetaminophen, a Tylenol, that would be like cutting that tablet into 20 pieces and taking one little dose. So when doctors, not hippies, not spiritists, not shamans, scientists, medical doctors began to use MMA, began to use wild mushrooms, began to use LSD, microdosed, very microdosed. I'm not supporting being inebriated, but when they began to use that as in a microdose fashion, the research fascinating. I just want to encourage you to do 20 hours of research on that. It's very fascinating because what happens in the mind and the neural pathways, which allows the body to release the trauma, to no longer keep its victim into a hypervigilant state, is truly miraculous. Now, obviously, LSD and wild mushrooms and MMA and all these different things are illegal substances. But isn't it something? The internet is used as a single greatest tool along with social media for pornography addiction. Yet, 1 in 100 people who use the internet will come out of poverty. Mhm. You're looking at somebody who made $5,000 per year and was a single mom. Some of you aren't looking, you're listening. And I made my first million 6 years later because of the internet. Never made less than $1 million because of the internet. So, is the internet something God would have us to avoid? Take that same logic, please, into your position on cannabis use. Talk to you soon. I hope you'll join me on Monday. Bye-bye.